The enlargement debate is linked to efficiency, not a particularly popular subject matter in smaller and middle-sized member states. We all should be ready to look at the various proposals to improve the governability of the EU in our domestic discussion, including the shift to qualified majority vote in some area.
Tady jsou bruselské chlebíčky, váš průvodce zákulisím politiky v Evropské unii.
This week, European Parliament called for adopting institutional and financial reforms to handle discussed enlargement of the EU to 30 or more members. European Commission should come with their first kick-off next week, and EU leaders want to agree on a timetable for reforms during current Belgian EU presidency. In the Czech Republic, however, President Pavel got into hot water last year, only calling for a start of a debate on a possible moving to qualified majority voting, because many Czech politicians, and not only them, do not want to give up veto right in the EU. So how should be the EU reformed so it can work effectively with a larger number of members and the states don't have to worry about securing their national interests? And does the EU need any reforms at all? That's what this special English edition of our weekly podcast will be about.
Hello, here is Filip Nerad. You are listening to the Brussels Bites podcast of the Czech Radio. And our today's guests are Daniela Schwarzer, political scientist and member of the executive board of the Bertelsmann Foundation from Germany.
Hello, very pleased to be here.
And Olivier Costa, research professor of Sciences Po in Paris. Hello.
Hi.
Both you are leading authors or rapporteurs of a report of 12 independent experts from Germany and France on EU institutional reforms, and that's the topic we will discuss here today. So I would like to ask from the, let's say, from Czech point of view, because here the main debate is about joining the enlargement process with reform process. So how do you view this proposal or this idea not to link the enlargement of EU with the reform of the functioning of the institutions, which is promoted, for example, by the Czech Republic? Is it possible to do it separately?
Both have to go hand in hand. The European Union today at 27 member states needs to prepare for enlargement. And it's not only the institutional issues, but admitting maybe 6, 8 or even 10 more countries to the EU means the way decisions are made needs to be reworked. We need to look at how the policies can be reformed, and then how the budget of the future should look like. This is not only because the numbers growing, but it is because the world around us has been changing, and there are so many new challenges the European continent is facing, and the European Union, as a group of countries that have decided to work more closely together, can really be stronger and should be stronger, and when it grows geographically, that shouldn't weaken its capacity to act and its legitimacy. That's why, in our view, and the report states this very clearly, both have to go hand in hand, which doesn't mean we should use the excuse to delay the procedure of negotiating accession. But it means both sides, the EU and the countries that want to become members, have to take responsibility for their own part of the work that needs to be done. And that means discussing within the EU and with candidate countries how the EU of the future looks.
You agree, Olivier?
Yeah, I agree. So there is always that argument saying that the Lisbon Treaty, the last treaty we had that entered into force in 2009, was designed to manage the enlargement, to be enlargement-proof. So you can always argue and saying we already have that treaty which is foreseeing the possibility of enlargement, and we could conduct the enlargement within the existing treaty. It's true. But then there is a very high risk of a deadlock of EU institution coming very soon. Already it's very difficult to decide in the current setup of institution. We see that at each European summit where there are some conflict, especially with Mr. Orbán, and if we add another 5 or 10 members to the table, you increase the divergences in the position and in the interest. You could lead to a situation where very soon a decision would be nearly impossible. And as Daniela said, the world has been changing because now European integration is not about only organizing the free circulation of goods and finding new norms on TVs or toys. choice. It's also matters of security. It's matters of very important and pressing challenges, migration, global warming, and so on. Just challenging that don't wait. So the EU needs also to change its way of functioning, not to take 3 years to address any issue which comes on the agenda.
The argument of the people who are against the combining of these two processes is that when you combine this, it could prevent EU from enlarging because we will wait until the reform process will be finished and so on. And they add maybe that's even the aim, how to stop the enlargement process. Might it be true?
I don't think so, because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, in May 2022, said it would take decades for Ukraine to join the EU, and he was very much criticized for saying that. It's true that if we use the old way of organizing enlargement, it would take a very long time, or the other solution is that the EU would welcome member states that are not ready to respect all the existing EU norms. So, in any case, enlargement is not an easy process, and I cannot think that making a couple of institutional reform would take longer than the time which is needed for the candidate country to prepare themselves to be a full member. So this is not new. It has already been decided 30 years ago in 1993, the idea that European integration would at the same time prepare for enlargement and prepare for deepening by reforming the treaties. It's two different discussions that can exist in parallel, and I think that, in my view, there is no plot of those who want to reform the treaty to avoid enlargement, and I guess that people who are thinking, like us, that we need to reform the treaty are really willing the enlargement to happen, but to happen in decent conditions.
So is it even possible that the future EU with 30 or more members can effectively work without any changes of functioning of institutions and their setting? Daniela?
I think there's a big danger that an EU with 30 or even more members internally gets paralyzed. We already now see a change of behavior by certain governments, and that is playing a veto on matters that are not really essential to national interest, but just to block the process or to get some concessions elsewhere. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is criticized for that. So this behavior, already shows us that national vetoes, misused, can create a situation that is very bad for the European Union. The point here is that we have all reason to increase the capacity to act of the EU and not to weaken it. And so bringing in more members should make the EU more able to defend our collective interests together, which is why our report makes a number of proposals that wouldn't only improve the capacity to act, hence decision-making capacity, and the instruments that the EU needs, but also the legitimacy and the transparency of the European Union. It is, I think, really important to think about the European Union of the future as a group of countries that have found their way together to protect their interests and their sovereignty in a better way because they cooperate. And this idea that a deeper European Union violates national interests or undermines national sovereignty, I think has to be questioned in the new world we are facing. Because in my view, not even a large country like Germany is really able to defend its own interests alone, which is why Germany needs the single market, it needs the euro, it needs, in the future, probably more closer defense cooperation in the EU. So I think we are on track if we get it right to stabilize our continent in a better way, if we enlarge and we reform the EU at the same time.
The second argument, which comes from the Czech government, but not only from it, is that if EU should be reformed, then without opening of EU treaties. You propose in your report 6 options of treaty changes, but at the same time you show that there are many changes possible without opening treaties. So is it possible to make a better working EU without changing of the treaties?
Yeah, there are things to do. We can, for instance, reduce the number of the members of the European Parliament and find a new system of allocation without changing the treaties. We can maybe change the organization of the Commission to avoid commissioners fighting for the same file without changing the treaties. We can also have more qualified majority voting in the Council instead of unanimity without changing the treaty, because there are provisions in there. But my view on that is that if we organize the enlargement, and a massive enlargement, which is already a very big challenge, why not improving a bit the treaties and make them more efficient? It's about efficiency. Then there is always that argument on sovereignty of the member states, but European integration, since the very beginning, since 1950, is a trade-off between sovereignty of state and gaining something, being part of some collective body. So there is no way for a country to remain in the EU without accepting some trade-offs on sovereignty. So the idea is that, okay, you will renounce to a bit of your sovereignty because there will be more majority voting in the Council. In exchange of that, you will be part of a bloc which is capable to protect itself against Mr. Putin. It's just a matter of choice, but it is not possible to have both at the same time, keeping your full sovereignty and being part of a powerful assembly which is capable to provide public goods.
Is it possible in today's political atmosphere in the EU, where we see there is not enough will to change the current state, to change the treaty? So is it will of national states to give their powers to the EU level?
The debate in Europe has moved a lot over the past 1 and 2 years. First of all, the fact that we are now seriously discussing the accession of maybe 8 new members, that is a big change. And why is this so? Because the worry that instability, external interference, maybe even violent conflict extends to more of our neighboring countries, that is very real. And the EU wants to react to that not only because of the interest of the accession countries, but in its own, very own self-interest. And to the extent that the debate on enlargement has changed, I also see a rethink of the reform debate. There are still governments that adamantly say, no, we don't want to touch the treaties, and we don't even want to discuss reforms that can be done without treaty change. But others have really moved positions. And one of the topics that has pushed the debate forward is the need to protect the rule of law in the European Union. This is not only a normative evaluation of our current situation, because, as Western democracies, we do want rule of law if we have such a close relationship with others in the European Union. It's not only the normative standpoint, it is also the insight that if we cannot guarantee the rule of law in the European Union, then our whole idea of creating a single market with mobility for goods, services, but also people, and of course capital, that this no longer can hold, because you need legal certainty, you need rule of law across borders. And so I think we have reached a point where both the external developments and the internal developments, and questioning the rule of law is one of the most dangerous ones for the EU, that this has reached a point where governments are starting to rethink. Now, the way you framed it, is it about transferring our sovereignty to the European level? I don't think that is necessarily the right question. As Olivier has said, we are looking at reforms that increase the efficiency, the transparency, and also the legitimacy of the system. When we talk about the qualified majority vote, we are not introducing a new principle. What we are saying is the general principle upon which decisions are made should be extended to further areas. And we know, of course, that those areas are among the more sensitive ones, like foreign affairs or security matters. And because we are aware of those sovereignty concerns, we have various proposals how to protect national sovereignty. For instance, to delegate a decision where a country feels a vital interest is threatened, it should be delegated to the heads of state and government in the European Council. We also say we need to look at the voting weights, because right now the larger member states like Germany and France, they have a huge weight in qualified majority voting. So we suggest a relative reduction for the big countries. In a way, I think we make proposals which, if a real national interest, a vital interest is touched, protect the country. But we make proposals which, first of all, will prevent a veto which is just a tactical one, not a substantive one, as we discussed about the case of Hungary earlier. And secondly, we also make proposals which can have a good effect on the way negotiations are conducted. What we heard from people who have witnessed so many EU negotiations is that if for a certain decision there is a possibility to decide with qualified majority, this disciplines the negotiation process. And in the end, they can all decide to not take a qualified majority vote, but to negotiate as long as there can be a consensus. But the fact that there could be a qualified majority vote brings them to a more serious position to actually forge a compromise. And I think that would be very beneficial for the decision-making system.
Yeah, we will get definitely to the qualified majority voting later, but I would like to ask one thing that is often repeated here in the Czech Republic, and it's a possibility to carrying out of the reforms by using so-called passerelle clause. Could it solve the issue, or only in the question of the voting that Daniela mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. Within the treaty today, there is what is called the passerelle clause, the possibility to decide at unanimity to stop using unanimity. So you collectively decide to move to qualified majority voting, which is a bit the same than doing a treaty change, it's just easier. But the discussion on that topic is not very easy. And our take on that is that if it never happened since today, it's because it's not easy to decide on that. I'm going back to your previous question saying, do you think that the context today is good for a treaty change? It has never been since 1950. Treaty negotiation has always been something super difficult, and it was always very easy to be skeptical and say there are very contrasted views and different interests, and by default it's impossible to have an agreement. But we had a very large number of treaties through the years. It was possible to find an agreement because you negotiate things in a package. I think the advantage of having a treaty negotiation is that you can bring to the table various files and give satisfaction to each player on something else. If you discuss only on qualified majority voting, maybe the discussion is a bit more difficult. But if you have a more global discussion where you will make a connection between the issue of enlargement, which is very important for some member states, not for others, the issue of efficiency of EU institutions, the issue of rule of law, as mentioned by Daniela, and you put all that together. And if you add to that discussion over the budget, discussion about policies and the priorities, then you can find a deal which is bringing satisfaction to everyone. Some will accept more qualified majority voting even if they don't like very much the idea, because it's a price to pay for the development of a new policy or for the organization of the enlargement. This is the way it has always been done at EU level, and there is no reason to try another way today.
So Olivier Costa, who is still a guest of Brussels Bites with Daniela Schwarzer, and we are speaking about the reforms of EU. Let's go to the very sensitive question that you already pointed out, and that's departure from unanimity voting and move to qualified majority voting, with, in your report, with certain exceptions, safeguards and opt-outs. However, retaining of the veto right in some areas is sometimes in member countries something that they don't want to give up for any reason. We can hear it here in the Czech Republic and certainly in other member countries. So is it realistic that member countries will give up this right?
At the moment, there clearly is no unanimity on the matter. But we are, in my view, at the beginning of a conversation. If you look at the case of the Czech Republic, I think there are reasons to say that sometimes the Hungarian vote runs against the Czech interest, for instance, when it was on sanctioning Russia or on supporting Ukraine. And so you can turn the discussion around both ways, that sometimes it's not in your national self-interest to have someone other have a veto. What I wish to say is that we are really serious about the safeguards for true and deep national interests. And that's why the idea that you can have a qualified majority vote in the Ministerial Council, but if a country says, this is so vital to my country, I want the heads of state and government to decide, this de facto means some selected decisions you will always be able to transfer to the heads of state and government who decide by unanimity. And I think that's the best protection you can offer. Secondly, the fact that those policy areas that already have qualified majority voting as a possibility don't necessarily always use it needs to be looked at more closely. Because, of course, there's no interest in outvote a country with a true deep interest. And so the effect of the QMV option to discipline the countries to find a compromise is very important. And we were told by negotiators in Brussels how important it is to have this as a potential card to be played, but then not to vote by QMV, but to build a robust consensus which will enhance the implementation of measures afterwards. So I think those are all elements that need a honest consideration in the debate, and also the fear of mostly small countries that then they can be outnumbered needs to be looked at, and that is why we suggest that the weight of France and Germany and other larger players in the EU may need to be slightly reduced to shift the balance between who can form a blocking minority in the interest of the smaller countries. And I think those three measures taken together should make it possible to extend qualified majority voting a little further. And let's not forget, this is the regular decision-making procedure already. And in most cases in the EU, this has been applied in a very responsible way. And we can see from so many decisions that happen almost every day that there always is an interest to take into account really important national interests in the system.
The most interesting thing in this case is always that Germany, the biggest country, is the most overvoted country in the Council. It's not the small member states, but the big one, the Germany. The mostly mentioned case where the move to qualified majority voting should take place are the foreign policy issues, but you recommended also the budgetary issues. Why?
Because budget is vital, and because we are today in a new configuration. It's not only about institution. It's about politics. In the past, I guess that the difference between unanimity or qualified majority voting was not that important. It was symbolically important, but when there is unanimity, there is the search of consensus. It's not everyone around the table agreeing and raising the hand and saying, yes, it is. No one around the table saying, I'm really upset by that decision. And the same as Daniela said for qualified majority voting, it's not about people pushing on buttons and counting. In most cases, 90% of the cases, it's about just finding some sort of consensus. And okay, if there are still two guys around the table who are not that happy, you know that there is a majority. Now situation is changing. Situation is changing because we have leaders around the table who are doing what Daniela was mentioning, the cross-issue veto. You veto a decision not because you don't like it, but because you want to blackmail the other one on another issue. And this makes the functioning of the EU impossible. So we have seen that in several summits now with Mr. Orban, vetoing some decision regarding foreign affairs, not because of the foreign affairs, but because of issues of money, because he wants the funds of the EU to run his country, and because there are new rules of conditionality to oblige him to respect values. So if we go in that direction with players around the table that are not very loyal to the other one and that are using all sorts of institutional tricks, then we need new rules to overcome those difficulties. I mean, everybody was happy with the previous situation, but at some point you just need to take into account a reality, and another reality is the growing number of member states. So it cannot be that the EU will eternally decide everything at unanimity of a very large number of member states, because otherwise this would be least common denominator and doing nothing. And as we mentioned before, there are now some very pressing challenges. I mean, when Mr. Putin is invading Ukraine, you don't have three years to decide on something. You need to be quick, and then it's again a trade-off between your sovereignty and the efficiency of the system. So budget is another very important issue on which the EU needs to be a bit more flexible, because you can understand that each country has its own budgetary interest when voting on the budget, and it is not possible to continue a unanimity regarding that, because it will be a story of constant blackmail of some members.
And what about enlargement of the EU itself? New members now needs to be accepted and ratified by unanimity. Even this should change to QMV?
Not the final decision on accession, because that is of a constitutional nature to the European Union, and that's why the agreement of all existing member states needs to be given. However, we also see that over time, opening new chapters in the accession process, so taking the next step with a country, is sometimes blocked on the grounds of bilateral conflicts, for instance, between countries. This has been a problem for several Western Balkan countries recently, and we think that is something that should be overcome by introducing qualified majority voting to move the process forward. But in the end, because this is a change to the primary law that defines the EU, if you increase the number of member states, it won't be possible without the consent of all countries involved.
Now we get to the enlargement. You recommend in your report to set a goal to be ready for enlargement by 2030. Now we have candidate countries that haven't been able to move significantly in this process for 10 or even 20 years. Could it motivate them to speed up the preparation in 6 years?
The point is not to say that some member states will enter the EU in 2030. The point is to say that the EU needs to be ready by 2030. The fact that some countries did not progress much in the negotiation in the past time, it's also because there was no real perspective for them. It was pretty clear that some member states were not really willing to organize the enlargement. It was pretty clear also that the EU was not really organizing that. So we need to create a double dynamic, a dynamic on the side of the EU to get ready to prepare enlargement as early as 2030, and some countries are maybe ready by that. Countries like Montenegro or even Moldova are really integrating EU norms at a very high pace. And at the same time, it would give a sign for candidate country to say, okay, the EU is now working to welcome you as soon as 2030. Make the necessary effort, and you can make it. If you take the history of European integration, what always worked was to set up a deadline for something to be ready. 5 years to organize the agricultural policy, 10 years to organize the single market, the date of 92 for the single market, and the dates for the euro. So we need a similar system of a deadline to push everyone to mobilize. Otherwise, it's always possible to say, on the side of EU institution, okay, we will move when they will be moving. And then it's a story where everyone is waiting for the other one to move. So we need to organize things in a more pushy way, in a more proactive way, and say to the next parliament that will be elected in June, you have now 5 years with the Commission and the Council to make the EU ready for enlargement.
So it should make a pressure rather on EU rather than on the candidate countries.
No, both have their homework to do. The EU needs to get enlargement ready, and it needs to show all candidates that it is serious about being enlargement ready, which then makes it more difficult for governments of candidate countries to blame the lack of progress on the EU. So I think it's a collective effort. We shouldn't waste time on blaming the others, but really look at what all sides have to contribute. And I think this is really the moment we are now in, that people realize that the EU still is a very attractive place to be, which is why so many countries want to get in. The EU should be proud of that and not worry in the sense of, doubting its own system. Yes, the system needs to be improved, but we have a real treasure. I mean, we have a peaceful continent for those who are in the EU. We have prosperity, and still we need to get ready for the future. And so all sides have their work to do, and then there is a real possibility that the EU grows and strengthens itself at the same time.
We have to mention that the year 2030 was mentioned also by the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, while, for example, President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, did not say any year.
Yeah.
For sure, maybe.
But he did mention it as a date for enlargement. We said we can't commit for the candidates, right? We can only comment on what we think the EU should be doing, because that was our task to get the EU enlargement ready. But it plays the ball back and says, look, if the EU is serious about 2030, where are you? And I think that is something that needs also the scrutiny within the countries and the opinion of citizens. Right now, in some countries, there is less credibility of the accession process. Citizens think this won't happen, but if there is a new dynamic, I believe there could also be positive pressure on governments from their own citizens to actually seize the moment. So I think it's important that both sides really, really get going and prepare their part.
Is it better to join new members by smaller groups or take more of them at once, the so-called Big Bang enlargement, for example, in 2004, when the Czech Republic and other 9 countries joined the EU?
Both configurations have their advantage. If you take all the member states at once, you can say you need only one treaty of accession, and maybe you can link that with an institutional reform, so it makes it easier, and you avoid also the situation of new member state vetoing the next one. And we have, for instance, some conflict between some countries in the Western Balkans, and there is a high risk that if one comes before the other one, it will block the next one. But we think that regatta is more realistic, because as
regatta is the smaller group. Yeah.
By group. Certainly not one by one, but by small groups, because the point is to have an approach which is merit-based. So there need to be an encouragement for countries to do better. If you do better, you will enter earlier. Otherwise, if it's just a group, then it's like in theory of games. No one will be mobilized because everyone will be counting on the other one to make an effort first. So if it's a merit-based approach, it means that you take a responsibility for your own country. If you are quick, you will enter earlier. Whereas if we do a group, even if 7 are doing very well, if 3 are not doing well, they will slow down the process for the whole group. So regatta is not ideal because you need a large number of treaties. There is a risk of those cross vetoes between new member states, but I think it's more realistic and it's certainly more efficient.
Another proposal of yours that attracted big attention was the 4-tier EU integration. You recommend to create such a 4 circles of belonging to the EU, inner circle of deep integration, EU itself, associated membership and European political community. Wouldn't it damage the EU internally when you divide member states into certain categories, even though they are already now in this way? But it has not been so institutionalized, I would say. So cannot this categorization of different countries make some harm?
The picture that we have in our report with the concentric circles is actually a description of the reality we have. We have an EU and we have a more deeply integrated core, which is the Eurozone. And then around it, we have other layers. We have the European Economic Area, and then there's an outer ring where there's a name, the European Political Community, but this is not yet a really defined concept. Now, of course, we discussed how this impacts the whole debate on enlargement. And also, we discussed what does it mean for current EU members. There are some who sit in the core, they are in the Eurozone, in the single market, so they have everything essentially. And then there are others who don't have the euro. More and more come in because of very good economic and security reasons. But then you have countries that may not, in the medium term, want to respect some of the principles of the EU. And we actually discussed where could countries that do not respect the rule of law, where could they go? And one of the sobering discoveries we had was that they can't even be in the European Economic Area, where you would have a Norway or Switzerland, because that also, those close economic ties require a fully functioning rule of law system. So that made us think, okay, if a country really does no longer want to abide by the EU treaties, it would move very far out. That's how we came to this picture, which again is a is a way of presenting the reality we have at the moment. But then we thought further and we said, okay, but maybe there are good reasons because of the changing geopolitical context to think more about the next ring around the EU, because there may be countries who do not want to go fully in, who don't want to be in the institutions, who don't want to be full single market members, and who definitely don't want the euro. That can happen. And we developed a concept where we said, okay, for them, a sort of closer associate membership can be thought up, which would put a more systematic approach to the relationship with the EU, would offer advantages for both sides, and would still be a very stable tie. What we do not suggest is that this is a waiting room which is forever. We totally think it's every single country's choice where it wants to go. And some countries may find it more attractive to have this third ring relationship, and even countries like the United Kingdom. By the way, we didn't talk about the United Kingdom in our group. It wasn't our mandate. However, the United Kingdom talked about us and the report. And they were really interested to explore how a relationship which is not a membership can be more productive than what they currently have. So it's a very interesting evolution of things.
Yeah. The Outer Circle European Political Community was originally designated as a project that has nothing to do with European Union. Now it would be treated a little bit like an antechamber of the EU, or understand it not correctly?
It's not an antechamber. The point is, European political community is not a product of the EU, but the EU has been involved since the very beginning, because there were representatives of the institution coming to all summits. And if you look at the list of countries, the most powerful and populated country, most of them are in the EU. And then European political community is including a limited number of big countries like United Kingdom or Turkey, and a lot of very small countries that are a bit around. So by matter of fact, the European political community is some sort of extension of the EU, whether it is said or it is not said, and it will work like that. And I think the new geopolitical context make it very useful to have such a forum. It's quite astonishing to see that there was nothing like that, because the Council of Europe never played that role. The Council of Europe has currently 46 member states, mainly all the countries in Europe, on the continental Europe, but never played that role of a political forum. So European political community could be a very nice place to discuss about important topic of security or energy or whatever, even trade, with a country who do not want to be involved in anything in an institutionalized way. And then the third tier is a way also to rationalize a bit what we have. So the point is not to create Europe à la carte, is on the contrary to simplify things. Because today the EU has close relation with a very large number of countries who do not want to be in the EU, like UK, like Switzerland, like Norway, like Turkey, like all the microstates who are using the euro, like Andorra, San Marino, etc. And there is no frame for that discussion. So maybe it's time to have something which is a bit more organized, not to have tailor-made relation with each of those countries. And in our view, the system in full circle has nothing to do with enlargement. I mean, it's totally possible for a candidate country to apply to be part of the third circle, but it's totally possible also for a country to say, no, what I want is only full membership, and I will wait until I'm there. It's just to organize a bit better what we already have concretely.
Yeah, for the European political community, it would mean that it would give a kind of vision what to do next, because now I a little bit missed the vision what to do with this project.
That's true, and will be very interesting to see, because it evolves summit by summit, and the next one will be held in the UK. So it will be very interesting to see whether the United Kingdom decides to take a real continental perspective and deal with issues of real importance for the continent, or whether what is currently being thought that it might happen, that they really focus on migration issues, which is basically driven by their own consideration. That can surely be an issue which should be treated there, but there are more issues to put onto the agenda. So it will be very interesting to see whether Britain uses this as an important tool to have a continental conversation on issues that are of mutual concern.
Finally, I would like to hear your personal tip or prediction. Will we have a functioning EU change and expanding EU with the new members by 2030?
We will have some moderate reforms, maybe even some introduction of change through a accession treaty model, which we suggest. I'm not sure there will be a larger approach like a convention, but I think we actually should have that conversation. And I do think that some countries who are really trying to push forward, like Montenegro, even Moldova, although it has a frozen conflict on its own territory, that they are very, very determined to do their part of the work, and then the EU should be ready to welcome them.
Olivier?
Yeah, social science are not very well equipped to predict the future. You can only predict the past and write a nice book to explain why things happen as they happen. What I know is that we need to prepare ourselves in case it's possible to do something. Things can change very quickly depending on national elections. It's enough to have one big country with a government that would be fiercely Eurosceptic to block the whole possibility of having a treaty change and even an enlargement. But what I also know is that if we don't have ideas, if we don't have solutions, if we don't brainstorm about how to organize the enlargement, how to organize a treaty reform, what kind of institutional reform we could do, what is acceptable or not, and if we don't prepare for that, even if all the conditions are met in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of time, it will be impossible to move. So we really need to be ready for the good condition to be exploited to have that enlargement and possibly treaty reform.
So let's see what will be in 6 years. To our guests of Brussels Bites podcast, Daniela Schwarzer and Olivier Costa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening us. See you next time. All the best wish you, Filip Nerad.